The Vanishing Guide, a camping safari gone wrong. Chapter 1. Excitement and Anticipation. The Thompson family had been looking forward to this safari camping trip for months. John and Sarah Thompson, along with their teenage children Emily and Michael, had saved up for over a year to afford this once-in-a-lifetime adventure in the African savanna. As their small charter plane touched down on the dusty airstrip, the family could barely contain their excitement. "We're finally here," exclaimed 15-year-old Emily, her face pressed against the window as she took in the vast expanse of golden grasslands stretching to the horizon. Her 17-year-old brother Michael was equally enthralled, his eyes scanning the landscape for any signs of wildlife. "I can't wait to see some lions and elephants up close," he said eagerly. John and Sarah exchanged pleased smiles, happy to see their children so excited after the long journey from their home in suburban Chicago. This trip was meant to be a special bonding experience for the family before Emily and Michael left for college in a few years. As they disembarked from the small plane, the heat and dryness of the African air hit them like a wall. The family squinted in the bright sunlight, taking in their surroundings. A weathered wooden sign welcomed them to Serengeti Safari Adventures. A tall, muscular man with deeply tanned skin approached them with a wide smile. "Welcome to Tanzania. I'm David, and I'll be your guide for your overnight camping safari," he said in accented but clear English, shaking hands with each family member in turn. David helped the Thompsons load their luggage into a rugged-looking Land Rover. As they climbed in, he gave them a brief overview of the plan. "We'll drive for about 2 hours to reach our campsite, stopping along the way to view any wildlife we encounter. Once we set up camp, we'll go on an evening game drive before dinner. Tomorrow morning we'll do an early drive to catch the animals at their most active, then break camp and head back." The family listened attentively, their anticipation growing with each word. As David started up the Land Rover and they bumped along the rough dirt road leading away from the airstrip, the Thompsons felt like their adventure was truly beginning. Over the next 2 hours, David proved to be an expert and engaging guide. He pointed out various animals in the distance, herds of wildebeest and zebra, a towering giraffe munching on acacia leaves, and even a pride of lions lounging in the shade of a tree. The family was enthralled, snapping photos and peppering David with questions which he answered patiently and thoroughly. By the time they reached the campsite, a beautiful spot overlooking a small watering hole, the Thompsons felt they had already gotten their money's worth. But the real adventure, they thought, was just beginning. Chapter 2. Setting up camp. The campsite was a clearing surrounded by acacia trees, with a breathtaking view of the savanna stretching out before them. David expertly maneuvered the Land Rover into position and began unloading their gear. "All right, let's get camp set up," he said cheerfully. "John and Michael, if you could help me with the tents, that would be great. Sarah and Emily, perhaps you could unpack the cooking equipment and start getting dinner ready." The family eagerly set to work. John and Michael, under David's guidance, erected 2 large, sturdy tents, one for the parents and one for the teenagers. Sarah and Emily unpacked the camping stove and began preparing a simple but hearty meal of pasta with canned sauce and vegetables. As they worked, David kept up a steady stream of information about the area, the wildlife, and camping safety. "Remember," he cautioned, "we're guests in the animals' home here. Always be aware of your surroundings, and never wander off alone. If you need to use the bathroom during the night, use the portable toilet in your tent or wake me up to accompany you outside the campsite." The family nodded seriously, the reality of their situation sinking in. They were truly in the wild now, with all its beauty and potential dangers. As the sun began to sink towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, David announced it was time for their evening game drive. The family piled back into the Land Rover, cameras at the ready. The drive was magical. In the golden light of the setting sun, they saw elephants gathered at a watering hole, a leopard draped languidly over a tree branch, and a group of hyenas skulking through the grass. David's knowledge seemed endless as he pointed out various species of birds and explained the complex ecosystem of the savanna. As darkness fell, David used a powerful spotlight to illuminate nocturnal creatures. The family gasped in awe at the glowing eyes of bush babies in the trees and the sinuous movements of a serval cat stalking its prey. Returning to the campsite, they found that Sarah and Emily had finished preparing dinner. The family ate hungrily, chatting excitedly about everything they had seen. David joined them, adding his own stories and insights. After dinner, they gathered around a small, controlled campfire, carefully monitored due to the dry conditions. David regaled them with local folklore and tales of his most exciting safari experiences. The Thompsons were captivated, feeling like they were living out the adventures they had only read about in books or seen in movies. As the fire died down and yawns began to punctuate the conversation, David suggested they turn in for the night. "We'll be up before dawn for the morning drive," he reminded them. "That's when we have our best chance of seeing some of the big cats hunting." The family retired to their tents, falling asleep to the distant sounds of the African night, the whooping of hyenas, the low grunt of hippos, and the rustle of the wind through the grass. Despite the unfamiliar surroundings, they felt safe and excited for what the next day would bring. Little did they know that their adventure was about to take an unexpected and frightening turn. Chapter 3: The Mysterious Disappearance. The first hints of dawn were just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when John Thompson awoke. He lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar sounds and smells surrounding him. Then he remembered they were on safari in Africa. A smile spread across his face as the previous day's excitement came flooding back. He gently shook Sarah awake. "Time to get up, honey. We don't want to miss anything." Sarah stirred and yawned. "Is David up yet? I don't hear anything outside." John listened. She was right, the campsite was eerily quiet. No sounds of their guide moving about, no smell of coffee brewing. That was odd, given how enthusiastic David had been about an early start. "I'll go check," John said, pulling on his boots and unzipping the tent flap. The campsite was bathed in the gray light of pre-dawn. John looked around, expecting to see David emerging from his own small tent or perhaps tending to the Land Rover. But the guide was nowhere to be seen. A tendril of unease began to curl in John's stomach. He walked over to David's tent and called out softly, "David? You up?" No response. John hesitated, then unzipped the tent flap and peered inside. The sleeping bag was empty and looked like it hadn't been slept in. Now genuinely concerned, John did a quick circuit of the campsite. There was no sign of David anywhere. The Land Rover was still parked where they had left it the night before. Everything looked exactly as it had when they'd gone to bed, except for the conspicuous absence of their guide. John hurried back to his tent. "Sarah," he said urgently, "David's gone." Sarah sat up, instantly alert. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean he's not in the camp. His tent looks like it hasn't been slept in. I can't find him anywhere." Sarah's face paled. "But he wouldn't just leave us here, would he? Maybe he went to gather firewood or something?" John shook his head. "Without the Land Rover? And he was so clear about not wandering off alone. Something's not right." They woke Emily and Michael, who reacted with a mixture of confusion and growing fear as their parents explained the situation. "What are we going to do?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. John tried to project a calm he didn't entirely feel. "First things first, we need to see if David left any kind of note or message. Then we'll try to raise someone on the satellite phone. David showed me how to use it yesterday." The family split up to search the campsite thoroughly, looking for any clue as to David's whereabouts or any message he might have left. But after an hour of searching, they had found nothing. The satellite phone, when John tried it, emitted nothing but static. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the Thompsons regrouped, fear now evident on all their faces. "I don't understand," Michael said. "Why would he just disappear like that? Could something have happened to him?" Emily asked hesitantly, voicing the fear they had all been avoiding. John and Sarah exchanged worried glances. They were trying to stay strong for their children, but the truth was, they were just as frightened and confused. "We don't know what happened," John said finally, "but we need to focus on what we're going to do now." We're alone in the African wilderness, and we need to figure out how to get back to civilization safely." The family fell silent, the magnitude of their situation sinking in. The exciting safari adventure they had dreamed of had suddenly turned into a nightmare of uncertainty and potential danger. And somewhere out in the vast savannah, the mystery of their vanished guide waited to be unraveled. Chapter 4. Taking Stock. As the reality of their situation settled in, the Thompson family gathered around the cold fire pit, their excitement from the previous evening replaced by anxiety and uncertainty. "Okay," John said, trying to keep his voice steady and authoritative. "Let's think this through logically. What resources do we have, and what are our options?" Sarah, always the practical one, began listing their assets. "We have the tents and sleeping bags. There's some food left, maybe enough for 2 or 3 days if we're careful. We have water, but not a huge amount. The Land Rover," Michael added. "But do any of us know how to drive it? It's not exactly like our SUV back home." John shook his head. "I watched David drive yesterday, but those manual transmissions can be tricky if you're not used to them. And navigating out here," he gestured to the vast, featureless savanna stretching out around them. "What about the satellite phone?" Emily asked hopefully. "It's not working," John replied. "Just static. Maybe it's broken, or maybe we're in a dead zone. Either way, it's not going to help us right now." The family fell silent, the gravity of their situation weighing heavily upon them. "So what are our options?" Sarah asked finally. John considered for a moment. "As I see it, we have 3 choices. 1, we stay here and wait for rescue. The safari company must have some way of tracking their vehicles or checking in with their guides. When they realize we're overdue, they might send someone to look for us. But we don't know how long that could take," Sarah pointed out. "Days, maybe?" John nodded grimly. "Option 2 is we try to drive ourselves out of here. But without knowing the route or how to navigate, we could easily get more lost than we already are. Plus, if something goes wrong with the Land Rover, we'd be in even worse shape." "What's option 3? Michael asked. "We walk out," John said simply. "Follow the tire tracks back the way we came. It's about a 2-day hike if I remember correctly." The family mulled over these options, each lost in their own thoughts. "I think we should stay here," Emily said finally. "It seems safest. We have shelter and some food and water. And this is where people will look for us first, right?" Michael disagreed. "But what if something happened to David? What if something dangerous is out there? We're sitting ducks here." "Michael's right," Sarah said. "I don't like the idea of just waiting here helplessly. But I'm not sure about walking out either. 2 days in this heat, with wild animals around." John stood up, decision made. "We'll compromise. We'll stay here today, just in case David comes back or help arrives. We'll try the satellite phone again every few hours. If no one comes by tomorrow morning, we'll set out on foot. We can leave a note here explaining where we've gone." The family nodded in agreement, somewhat relieved to have a plan, even if it wasn't an ideal one. "In the meantime," John continued, "let's inventory everything we have. Food, water, anything that could be useful. Sarah and Emily, can you handle that? Michael, you and I will see if we can figure out what's wrong with the satellite phone. Maybe we can get it working." As they set about their tasks, each family member was lost in their own thoughts. They had come to Africa seeking adventure, but not like this. The excitement of the safari had been replaced by a very real fear. Out there in the seemingly endless savannah, dangers lurked: lions, hyenas, elephants, not to mention the harsh sun and the risk of dehydration. And underlying it all was the nagging question: what had happened to David? Had he abandoned them, met with some accident, or was there something more sinister at play? As the sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down mercilessly on the exposed campsite, the Thompsons tried to focus on their immediate survival. But they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes, their every move observed from the surrounding grasslands. The adventure of a lifetime had become a fight for survival, and it was only just beginning. Chapter 5. a day of waiting. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down mercilessly on the exposed campsite. The Thompson family tried to stay busy, both to be productive and to keep their minds off their precarious situation. Sarah and Emily meticulously cataloged their supplies. The news wasn't great. They had enough food for maybe 3 days if they rationed carefully, and water for about the same, assuming the heat didn't drive up their consumption. John and Michael, meanwhile, had no luck with the satellite phone. Despite their best efforts, it remained stubbornly silent, emitting nothing but static no matter what they tried. Maybe it's solar-powered and just needs to charge? Michael suggested hopefully. John shook his head. I don't think so. David had it working yesterday evening. Something's wrong with it, but I can't figure out what. As the day wore on, the family's nerves began to fray. Every snapping twig or rustle in the grass made them jump. The beauty of the savanna that had so enthralled them yesterday now seemed ominous and alien. Emily tried to lighten the mood by sharing some of the facts about African wildlife that she'd learned from David the day before, but her voice trailed off as she realized that thoughts of their missing guide only increased their anxiety. Sarah insisted they all drink regularly, knowing dehydration was a serious risk in the African heat. She also made them eat, even though none of them felt particularly hungry. We need to keep our strength up, she said firmly. We don't know what's ahead of us. As the afternoon dragged on, John suggested they take turns keeping watch while the others rested in the shade of the tents. We don't want to be caught off guard if any animals wander into the camp, he explained. During his watch, Michael thought he saw dust in the distance, as if from an approaching vehicle. His heart leapt with hope, but after squinting at the horizon for several minutes, he realized it was just a heat mirage. His disappointment was crushing. Emily's turn at watch was marked by a terrifying moment when a family of warthogs burst out of the nearby brush. Her scream brought everyone running, and the warthogs fled as quickly as they had appeared. The adrenaline rush left them all shaky and even more on edge. Chapter 6. Preparations and Revelations. As night fell, the Thompson family began their preparations for the journey ahead. The excitement of their first night camping on the Savanna had been replaced by a grim determination to survive. We'll take one tent, John decided. It's extra weight, but we might need the shelter. We'll leave the other here with a note, in case anyone comes looking for us. They packed carefully, trying to balance the need for supplies with the reality of what they could carry across the harsh terrain. Water was their top priority, followed by food and first aid supplies. They also packed flashlights, matches, and anything else that might prove useful. As they worked, Michael suddenly stopped, a thoughtful look on his face. Hey, Dad, he said slowly. Remember how David was telling us about the local wildlife yesterday? John nodded, not sure where this was going. Well, he mentioned that leopards sometimes drag their prey up into trees to keep it safe from other predators. Right? A chill ran down John's spine as he realized what his son was suggesting. You think we should check the trees around the campsite? In case. He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah and Emily, overhearing this, looked horrified. But they all knew it had to be done. They had to know if something had happened to David. Arming themselves with flashlights, John and Michael cautiously began to search the area around the campsite, examining every tree carefully. Sarah and Emily huddled together by the Land Rover, jumping at every sound from the darkness. After a tense half-hour, John and Michael returned, looking shaken but relieved. No sign of anything, John reported. I think we can rule out an animal attack, at least in the immediate vicinity. This news brought mixed feelings. On one hand, they were relieved that they hadn't found David's body. On the other, it deepened the mystery of his disappearance and left them no closer to understanding what had happened. As they finished their packing, Emily suddenly gasped. Look, she cried, pointing towards the watering hole. The others turned to see a pair of glowing eyes reflecting the light from their flashlights. As they watched, frozen, a magnificent leopard emerged from the shadows. It regarded them coolly for a long moment before turning and melting back into the darkness. The encounter left them all breathless. It was a stark reminder of the wild beauty and danger that surrounded them. "I think we should take turns keeping watch tonight," John said, his voice husky. "Just in case." No one argued. They retreated to the remaining tent, huddling together for comfort and warmth. Despite their exhaustion, sleep was elusive. Every unfamiliar sound jolted them awake, their minds conjuring images of prowling predators or their mysteriously vanished guide. During his watch, John found himself pondering their situation. Something about David's disappearance didn't add up. The guide had seemed so professional, so dedicated to their safety. Why would he abandon them? And if he hadn't left voluntarily, what could have happened to him without leaving any trace? As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, John woke the others. They ate a meager breakfast, more out of necessity than hunger, and broke camp with efficient, nervous energy. John wrote a note explaining their situation and their plan to walk out, leaving it prominently displayed in the remaining tent. As the sun rose over the Savanna, the Thompson family shouldered their packs and set out, following the faint tire tracks that led back towards civilization. They walked in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The beauty of the African morning, the chorus of birdsong, the soft golden light, the distant silhouettes of grazing animals was lost on them. Their eyes scanned constantly for danger, their ears alert for any unusual sound. What they didn't realize was that their every move was indeed being watched. Hidden eyes followed their progress from the cover of the tall grass. The watchers remained unseen, biding their time. The Thompsons' ordeal was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Chapter 7. The journey begins. The African sun climbed higher in the sky as the Thompson family made their way across the Savanna. They followed the faint tire tracks left by their Land Rover, hoping they would lead them back to the airstrip where their adventure had begun just 2 days ago, though it felt like a lifetime had passed since then. John led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon and the surrounding grasslands for any sign of danger. Sarah brought up the rear, often glancing behind them, unable to shake the feeling that they were being followed. Between them, Michael and Emily trudged along, the weight of their backpacks and the seriousness of their situation evident in their slumped shoulders. The first few hours passed without incident. The family's spirits began to lift slightly as they made steady progress. They saw herds of zebra and wildebeest in the distance, and at one point, a giraffe peered at them curiously over the top of an acacia tree. Under different circumstances, they would have been thrilled by these sightings. Now they regarded the animals warily, always aware that where there were prey animals, predators were likely not far away. As the sun reached its zenith, the heat became almost unbearable. The family's water supply was diminishing faster than they had hoped, and John called for a break in the meager shade of a lone tree. "We need to conserve our water," he said, looking at their dwindling supply with concern. "Small sips, everyone. We don't know how far we still have to go." As they rested, Emily suddenly sat up straighter, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" she asked. The others fell silent, listening intently. At first, they heard nothing but the whisper of the wind through the grass and the distant calls of birds. Then, faintly, they caught the sound Emily had noticed, a low, rhythmic thumping. "Drums," Michael suggested, his voice hopeful. "Maybe there's a village nearby." But John's face was grim. "That's not drums," he said quietly. "That's helicopters, and they're getting closer." The family scrambled to their feet, peering at the sky in all directions. Hope surged through them. Had a search party been sent out? Were they about to be rescued? But as the sound grew louder and 2 helicopters appeared on the horizon, that hope quickly turned to confusion and then fear. These were not search and rescue helicopters. They were sleek, black, and distinctly military in appearance. "Those aren't Tanzanian," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. "What's going on?" Before anyone could respond, the helicopters were upon them. They circled once, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust that forced the Thompsons to cover their faces. When they looked up again, they found themselves surrounded by a dozen armed men who had rappelled down from the aircraft. The men were dressed in black tactical gear, their faces hidden behind balaclavas. They carried sophisticated-looking weapons and moved with the coordinated precision of highly trained operatives. "On your knees! Hands behind your heads!" one of the men shouted in accented English. Terrified and confused, the Thompsons complied. John tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but he was silenced by a rough shove from one of the armed men. As quickly as they had appeared, the mysterious forces had the family disarmed, blindfolded, and loaded into one of the helicopters. The aircraft lifted off, carrying the bewildered and frightened Thompsons to an unknown destination. In the chaos and noise, none of them noticed a familiar figure watching from the concealment of a nearby thicket. David, their missing guide, observed the scene with a mixture of guilt and determination. He hadn't wanted it to come to this, but he had a job to do. And now things were spiraling out of control. As the helicopters disappeared into the distance, David emerged from his hiding place. He had to move fast now. The situation had become far more complicated than he had ever anticipated, and the lives of the innocent family he had come to like were now in serious danger. With a heavy heart but a resolute mind, he set off across the savannah. He had calls to make and strings to pull. The real mission was just beginning. Chapter 8. Captivity and Confusion. The helicopter ride was a blur of noise, fear, and disorientation for the Thompson family. Blindfolded and with their hands bound, they could do nothing but sit in terrified silence as they were whisked away to an unknown destination. The flight seemed to last for hours, but it was impossible to tell for sure. Finally, they felt the helicopter descend and touch down. Rough hands grabbed them and led them out of the aircraft. They stumbled along, still blindfolded, across what felt like a paved surface and then into a building. The air became cooler, and their footsteps echoed, suggesting a large, enclosed space. After being led through what seemed like a maze of corridors, the family was abruptly pushed into a room. They heard a heavy door slam shut behind them, and then their blindfolds were removed. Blinking in the sudden light, the Thompsons found themselves in a stark, windowless room with concrete walls. A few cots lined one wall, and a small bathroom area was partitioned off in one corner. A single bare bulb illuminated the space from the ceiling. "Is everyone okay?" John asked immediately, looking at each family member in turn. Sarah nodded, pulling Emily and Michael into a tight hug. They were shaken but unharmed. "What's going on, Dad?" Michael asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Who were those men? Where are we?" John shook his head helplessly. "I don't know, son. I don't understand any of this." For the next few hours, the family huddled together on the cots, trying to make sense of their situation. They speculated about their captors. Were they terrorists? Criminals? Some kind of paramilitary group? But every theory seemed as unlikely as the next. "Do you think this has something to do with David disappearing?" Emily asked suddenly. The others looked at her in surprise. They had been so caught up in their current predicament that they had almost forgotten about their missing guide. "You might be onto something," Sarah said slowly. "This all started when he vanished. Maybe he was taken like we were." Before they could discuss this further, the door to their room suddenly opened. Two armed guards entered, followed by a tall, distinguished-looking man in a crisp suit. He surveyed the family with cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he said in a clipped British accent. "I apologize for the rough treatment, but I'm afraid it was necessary. My name is not important. What is important is that you understand your situation." He paused, letting his words sink in. The Thompsons stared at him, a mixture of fear and confusion on their faces. "You have stumbled into something much larger than yourselves," the man continued. "A complex game of international intrigue, if you will. Your safari guide, the man you knew as David, is not who you thought he was. He is, in fact, a highly trained operative working for, well, let's just say he works for people who are very interested in certain activities in this region." The family exchanged shocked glances. "David, a spy? It seemed impossible. We had hoped to extract David quietly without involving you," the man went on. "Unfortunately, Things did not go according to plan. And now I'm afraid you've seen too much. We can't simply let you go. What are you going to do with us? John demanded, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That, Mr. Thompson, depends on how cooperative you and your family choose to be. We have some questions about your interactions with David. Answer them truthfully, and this situation may resolve itself more quickly and comfortably for all of you. With that, he turned and left the room, leaving the stunned family to absorb this shocking turn of events. As the door locked behind him, the Thompsons looked at each other, the full gravity of their situation sinking in. They were pawns in a dangerous game they didn't understand, being held by people who clearly had no qualms about using force. And somewhere out there was David, not the friendly safari guide they had known, but a mysterious operative at the center of whatever this was. As fear and uncertainty gripped them, the Thompsons clung to each other, their dream vacation now a distant memory as they faced an uncertain and potentially dangerous future. The Thompson family was separated, each taken to individual rooms for questioning. Their captors were relentless, asking the same questions over and over again, clearly hoping to catch them in a lie or inconsistency. Tell us again about your conversations with David, the interrogator would demand. Did he ever mention any names? Places? Did he give you anything to hold or deliver? No matter how many times they answered, no matter how they insisted that David had been nothing more than their safari guide, their captors seemed unsatisfied. The family was given little time to rest between sessions, a tactic clearly designed to wear them down. John, as the father, bore the brunt of the interrogations. He was subjected to sleep deprivation and psychological pressure, but he steadfastly refused to say anything that might endanger his family. Sarah, too, remained strong, her maternal instincts driving her to protect her children at all costs. Emily and Michael, despite their fear, showed remarkable resilience. They stuck to the truth, recounting their brief time with David exactly as it had happened, no matter how many times they were asked. On what they thought was the fourth day of their captivity, it was hard to be sure without windows or clocks. Something changed. The distinguished man in the suit returned, this time with a tablet computer in his hand. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, he said, addressing John and Sarah, who had been brought together for this meeting. We owe you an apology. It seems we may have overreacted in our handling of your situation. He turned the tablet towards them, showing them a news article. The headline read, American family missing on safari, foul play suspected. Your disappearance has caused quite a stir, the man explained. The American government is putting pressure on Tanzania to conduct a thorough investigation. This complicates matters for us significantly. John and Sarah exchanged a look of cautious hope. Did this mean they might be released? As if reading their thoughts, the man continued, We can't simply let you go, I'm afraid. You've seen and heard too much. However, we may be able to arrange a controlled rescue. Before he could elaborate, alarms suddenly blared throughout the facility. The man's hand flew to his earpiece, his face darkening as he listened to whatever was being said. It seems, he said grimly, that our plans may need to change again. Your friend David appears to be more resourceful than we anticipated. As if on cue, they heard the sound of gunfire in the distance. The man swore under his breath and rushed out of the room, leaving John and Sarah alone, handcuffed to their chairs and more confused than ever. Meanwhile, in another part of the compound, David was indeed proving his resourcefulness. After days of careful planning and observation, he had managed to infiltrate the facility. His mission was clear: extract the Thompson family and get them to safety. As he moved silently through the corridors, neutralizing guards with ruthless efficiency, David's mind raced. He had never meant for the Thompsons to get caught up in this. They were innocent tourists, and he had genuinely enjoyed his time as their safari guide. But when he had received the coded message that his cover was blown, he had been forced to disappear quickly, hoping the family would be safely evacuated before his enemies closed in. Clearly, that hadn't happened. Now, he was determined to make things right, even if it meant blowing years of careful undercover work. Back in their holding room, Emily and Michael huddled together, listening to the sounds of chaos echoing through the building. Gunshots, shouts, and the continued blaring of alarms created a cacophony of danger. "What's happening?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. Michael shook his head, his face pale but determined. "I don't know, but this might be our only chance. We need to be ready to move if we get an opportunity." As if in answer to his words, the door to their room suddenly burst open. Both teenagers gasped in shock as a familiar figure entered. It was David, their safari guide, but not as they had known him. Gone was the friendly, easygoing demeanor. This David moved with the deadly grace of a trained operative, a gun held confidently in his hands. "Emily, Michael," he said quickly, "I know you must have 1,000 questions, but there's no time. We need to move now. Your parents are 2 levels up. Stay close to me, do exactly as I say, and I promise I'll get you all out of here safely." Chapter 10. The Great Escape. Emily and Michael hesitated for only a moment before nodding in agreement. Whatever was happening, David seemed to be their best chance at escape and reuniting with their parents. "Okay," Michael said, his voice steadier than he felt. "What do we do?" David tossed them each a small earpiece. "Put these on. I'll be able to give you instructions if we get separated." He then handed Michael a small pistol. "Do you know how to use this?" Michael's eyes widened as he took the weapon. I've been to a shooting range a couple of times with Dad." "Good enough," David said. "It's just a precaution. Stay behind me, and hopefully you won't need to use it." With that, David led them out into the corridor. The facility was in chaos. Alarms blared, emergency lights flashed, and they could hear shouting and gunfire in the distance. They moved swiftly but cautiously, David checking each corner before motioning the teenagers forward. Emily and Michael followed closely, their hearts pounding. As they reached a stairwell, David suddenly pushed them back, just as a burst of gunfire erupted. He returned fire, then turned to the siblings. "Change of plans. Your parents are being moved. We need to intercept them before they reach the helipad." They raced up the stairs, emerging onto a higher level. Here, the signs of conflict were more evident. They had to step over the bodies of fallen guards as they made their way down the corridor. Suddenly, David held up a hand, signaling them to stop. He cocked his head, listening intently, then smiled grimly. "This way," he said, leading them down a side passage. They rounded a corner and found themselves face to face with a group of armed men escorting John and Sarah. For a moment, everyone froze in surprise. David reacted first, diving forward and tackling the nearest guard. "Run!" he shouted to the Thompsons. Chaos erupted. John, despite his bound hands, managed to shoulder-check one of the guards. Sarah stomped hard on another's foot, then drove her knee into his groin. Michael, his hand shaking, raised the pistol David had given him. But before he could decide whether to fire, Emily grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and sprayed it in the guards' faces, creating a momentary smokescreen. "This way," David yelled, having dispatched his opponent. He quickly cut John and Sarah's bonds, and the reunited family followed him down the corridor. They could hear shouts and footsteps behind them as they ran. David led them through a maze of hallways, clearly familiar with the layout of the facility. "Almost there," he panted as they climbed another set of stairs. "The roof is just ahead. I have a chopper waiting." They burst out onto the roof, squinting in the sudden sunlight. A sleek helicopter sat on a helipad, its rotors already spinning. But before they could reach it, the door behind them slammed open. The distinguished man in the suit emerged, flanked by armed guards. "It's over, David," he called out, his voice nearly drowned by the helicopter's noise. "You can't possibly think you'll escape." David pushed the Thompsons towards the helicopter. "Get in," he ordered. "I'll hold them off." "No," Sarah cried. "We can't leave you." David's face softened for a moment. "I'm sorry for getting you all involved in this. Please go. Live your lives." Forget about all of this. John hesitated, then nodded grimly. He ushered his family into the helicopter. David turned to face their pursuers, raising his weapon. "You're right," he called out to the man in the suit. "I probably won't escape, but they will." What happened next was a blur of gunfire and shouting. The Thompsons, huddled in the helicopter as the pilot lifted off, caught glimpses of David diving and rolling, returning fire. As they rose into the air, they saw David take a hit, stumbling backwards. But even as he fell, he managed to toss something towards the helicopter. Michael, leaning out despite his parents' protests, caught it, a small USB drive. The last thing they saw as the helicopter banked away was David, lying on the roof, giving them a small salute before the facility disappeared from view. The family sat in stunned silence as the helicopter carried them away from the nightmare they'd been living. They were safe, but at what cost? And what secrets did the USB drive hold? As the adrenaline of their escape began to wear off, the Thompsons huddled together, overwhelmed by relief, grief, and lingering fear. Their ordeal wasn't over. They still had so many questions, and they knew that what they'd experienced would haunt them for years to come. But for now, they were together, they were alive, and they were free. As the African landscape rushed by below them, they held on to each other, grateful for their survival and the sacrifice that had made it possible. Chapter 11. Aftermath and Revelations. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of debriefings, medical checkups, and diplomatic negotiations. The Thompsons found themselves at the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam, surrounded by concerned officials and stern-faced security personnel. They recounted their story countless times. The safari, David's disappearance, their capture, and their dramatic escape. Each retelling brought back the fear and confusion they had experienced, but also reinforced their gratitude for having survived. It was during one of these debriefings that John finally remembered the USB drive David had tossed to them in his final moments. He handed it over to the officials, who immediately whisked it away for analysis. Hours later, a somber-looking man in a dark suit entered the room where the family was resting. He introduced himself as Agent Roberts from the CIA. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, Emily, Michael," he began, his voice grave. "First, let me say how relieved we are that you're safe. What you've been through, well, it's beyond what any civilian should ever have to experience." The family nodded, waiting for him to continue. "The information on the drive you recovered is significant," Agent Roberts said. "David, whose real name, by the way, was Daniel Hawkins, was one of our top operatives. He had been undercover for years, infiltrating a network of arms dealers and human traffickers operating in East Africa." The Thompsons exchanged shocked glances. Their friendly safari guide had been a CIA agent all along? "The men who captured you," Roberts continued, "were part of this network. They had discovered Daniel's true identity and were planning to eliminate him. By taking you hostage, they hoped to draw him out." "But why didn't he just leave us?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Why risk everything to save us?" Roberts smiled sadly. "That was just who Daniel was. He never left anyone behind. And, well, I think he genuinely cared for your family. You represented the normal life he had given up to serve his country." "Is he?" Emily couldn't finish the question. Roberts shook his head. "We don't know. There was a lot of blood on that rooftop, but no body. Daniel has vanished before. Until we have definitive proof otherwise, we're considering him missing in action." The agent then explained that the USB drive contained detailed information about the criminal network's operations. "Daniel's last act may have dealt a crippling blow to their organization," he said. "Your ordeal, terrible as it was, may have helped save countless lives." As Roberts prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "One more thing," he said. "We found this in Daniel's effects at the safari company." He handed John a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from David or Daniel. It was dated the day before he disappeared. "Dear Thompson family, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I want you to know that the time I spent as your guide was one of the brightest periods in a life that has seen too much darkness. Your joy, your love for each other, your excitement about experiencing this beautiful country. It reminded me of why I do what I do. I'm sorry for any pain or fear you may have experienced because of me. Please know that I would do anything to keep you safe. John, Sarah, cherish each other and your children. The love you share is more precious than you know. Emily, Michael, hold on to your sense of wonder. Don't let the darkness of the world dim your light. I hope that someday, somehow, our paths might cross again under better circumstances. Until then, live well and be happy. Your friend always, David, Daniel. As John finished reading the letter aloud, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The Thompsons sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, processing everything they had learned. Their African adventure had turned out to be far more than they had ever bargained for. They had glimpsed a world of danger and intrigue that most people never see. They had faced fear and uncertainty, and had emerged stronger for it. As they prepared to finally return home, the Thompsons knew that they would never be quite the same. They had a new appreciation for the complexities of the world, for the unseen battles fought by people like Daniel, and for the bonds that held them together as a family. And somewhere out there, they hoped David Daniel was alive, continuing his fight. They would always be grateful for the sacrifice he had made for them, and would carry the memory of their extraordinary safari guide with them always. As their plane lifted off from Tanzanian soil, the Thompsons looked out at the vast African landscape below. This land of beauty and danger, of light and shadow, had changed them forever. Their adventure was over, but its impact would last a lifetime. Epilogue. 1 year later, the Thompson family gathered in their Chicago home, a warm fire crackling in the fireplace as wind and snow whirled outside. It was the anniversary of their return from Africa, and they had made it a tradition to come together on this day to remember their extraordinary experience. John and Sarah sat close together on the couch, their hands intertwined. The ordeal had brought them closer, deepening their appreciation for each other and for the life they had built together. Emily, now in her first year of college, was home for the weekend. The events in Africa had inspired her to study international relations, with a focus on conflict resolution. She dreamed of making a difference in the world, of being a force for good like Daniel had been. Michael, in his senior year of high school, had thrown himself into outdoor and survival skills. The experience had awakened in him a desire to be prepared for anything, and he was considering a career in law enforcement or emergency services. As they sipped hot chocolate and shared memories of their trip, the good parts before everything went wrong, there was a knock at the door. John went to answer it, puzzled. They weren't expecting anyone, especially not on such a blustery night. He opened the door to find a delivery man holding a large package. "Special delivery for the Thompson family," the man said, handing over the box and a signature pad. John signed and brought the package inside, his curiosity piqued. The return address was unfamiliar, a P.O. box in Nairobi, Kenya. The family gathered around as John carefully opened the box. Inside, nestled in packing material, they found a beautiful hand-carved wooden sculpture of an African elephant family. There was no note, no explanation, but as they lifted the sculpture out of the box, something fell from beneath it, a small, folded piece of paper. Sarah picked it up and unfolded it with trembling hands. In a familiar handwriting were just a few words. "The elephant never forgets. Neither do I. Stay safe. D." The Thompsons looked at each other in stunned silence, a mix of emotions washing over them: surprise, relief, gratitude, and a touch of lingering fear. David Daniel was alive. He remembered them, and somehow he was still watching over them. As they placed the elephant sculpture on their mantle, the Thompsons felt a sense of closure, but also a renewed connection to their African adventure. Life had returned to normal, but they would always carry with them the lessons learned, the bonds strengthened, and the knowledge that out there in the world, they had a guardian angel named David. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, and the Thompson family huddled closer, grateful for each other and for the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. Their safari might have gone wrong in so many ways, but in the end, it had given them more than they could have ever imagined. And somewhere out there, in the vast savannas of Africa or the shadowy world of international intrigue, David continued his work, carrying with him the memory of the family that had reminded him of the goodness in the world he fought to protect. The end.
Subscribe for more.